And I just want to thank you all for tuning in. We're going to dive into this office hours. I'm super excited for us all to learn about how our ego is holding us back and how to overcome it. And a core goal of Dreamers and Doers is to amplify you and all of your journeys. And these kinds of intimate educational sessions really that are filled with so many insights, and this is all thanks to your fellow members. These are just such a great opportunity for us all to level up together. So before we officially begin, I just want to share a little bit of background on our esteemed expert today. So for 18 years, Ashley Reed helped shape marketing initiatives for leading global brands, including Amazon, iHeartMedia, US Soccer, and the NBA. And although she created success for herself and for her organizations, she felt an overall lack of alignment and fulfillment. So in 2016, Ashley began to make substantial changes. She became a certified coach, and she created 2 additional businesses, which allowed her to step away from her corporate career in 2019. After taking space to dive further into her own coaching journey, she fell in love with the impact of deep inner work, and she moved into coaching full-time. So now, as a transformational teacher and coach, Ashley uses her integrated experience to help her clients navigate challenges and create growth at work, at home, and within. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Ashley. We are just so excited to learn from your expertise today, and we know how valuable your time is, and we're just so grateful to you for investing in Dreamers and Doers and in the collective in this way.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you guys so much for being here. I feel the same. I know we all have very busy schedules and it's tough to take time out to do stuff like this. But first, I want to say, and I'm going to share my screen in a second to walk you guys through some content I have, because this will take a more teaching approach, but an interactive approach. So we're going to be doing questions as we go. So if you have something as it comes up, feel free to type it into the chat so we can make sure it's interactive as well. But kudos for showing up, because this title alone really triggered and scared your ego. It doesn't want you learning any of this. So the fact that you didn't listen to that and you showed up and you're going to learn the insights that you are today is a great sign of where you are in terms of connection with yourself and just making sure that you're having that awareness in terms of personal growth. So congratulations and kudos. That was the first big step. All right, I'm going to share my screen with you guys. Let me pull this over first. Okay, everybody's seeing it okay? All right, I see some thumbs up. Perfect. Okay, so we touched on this already. Your ego is holding you back. How can you overcome it? And first, I just want to say apologies. I'm a little under the weather. I woke up this morning not feeling great, so my voice does not normally sound like this. So thank you for bearing with me. I didn't want to bail on you guys today because I think this is really important and I love this time with our community. So I touched on this in the chat. I'm based in New York City. I've been with Dreamers and Doers this is year 2 now. And I'm excited to share this work with you. What I've done is I've pulled out some of the insights that I found have been the most impactful for my clients as we're talking about ego awareness, and put those into a condensed learning to try to help you navigate and see when your ego is showing up and create the change that you want to see. So first, I want to run you through what we'll be covering so you know what to expect. I wanted to start off by showing you an example of how my ego has shown up in my life and how it's created some conflict and change, because I think it can be really helpful when you're starting to learn about something to have some tangible examples to lean on. So I'll give you a little bit of an example about my ego, conflict, and experience and the change it created. And then we'll dive into what your ego is and is not, how your ego is showing up and holding you back, and then what you can do about it. And originally I had put Q&A at the end, but like I said, we're going to do things interactive. So if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat and we can touch on those as we go. All right, so first off, I want to take a few minutes, to tell you a little bit how my ego played a big role in me being here today. And these real world examples, I think, can be really helpful as we start talking about what it is and how it can show up in each of us. So we touched on this a little bit in my bio, but until a few years ago, this is where the majority of my time and energy was going. For 18 years, I led marketing initiatives for leading global brands, including the ones you see in this chart, and my ego loved this work. It was a way for it to keep me focused on doing, pushing, achieving, all with the ego promise that those actions were the path to the freedom that I was craving. And it did just that. It had me running global businesses and teams, moving quickly through promotions, navigating challenging internal dynamics. And it kept dangling this carrot that if I do these things, I'll be free. But these are the things in life that light me up, that make me smile, that give me energy. Things like freedom, time with the people I love, being present, internal and external curiosity, adventure, experiencing new things. All of these are part of who I am at my core, part of my true self. And this is where these two sides of my life intersected. Nowhere. And because there was no intersection or overlap to help create balance and cohesion, instead, I had this. Duality, conflict, unrest, frustration. I was living in this duality and conflict between my ego and true self that I wasn't fully aware of at the time, but that I could feel the impact of daily. We are born whole, complete, and free as our true self. But as our ego is created by our mind from our lived experiences, it starts to convince us that something is missing, that we need something external to achieve things like happiness, love, or freedom. And it does this all as a means to gain and maintain control. And for me, this internal duality and conflict between my ego and true self ended up being a huge catalyst for change. We touched on this some in my bio, but as I was experiencing all of this conflict, my true self finally broke through in 2016 and started to take the lead. And that created all of the change I needed to make bigger moments of change in my life. So I started building the businesses on the side. I got my coaching certification. I started creating space for myself so that I could hear myself and connect with myself. And all of that led to me being able to leave my corporate career. And so what you'll notice here is a shift between the decisions we make and the life we live when our ego is leading or when our true self is leading. So I hit my goals in 2019. So I had my ego driving me for 18 years, building this marketing business, building this career. I shifted gears, and within 3 years, I was able to hit my goals to leave that corporate career and step out on my own and do something that felt more in line with who I am and my values. And I think that's a good testament to when we shift gears to something we're really passionate about, how quickly we can move, because we're not being weighed down by feeling like we have to, or supposed to, or we should. We're being driven by, I want to, I can't wait, I'm excited about this. So there's a big shift that happens when we're being led by or driven by our ego versus when we're being led by or driven by our true self. So I think this is important to note because I did make all of these changes. I did leave the corporate world. But 1 week before my last day at Amazon, where I was an exec at the time when I was finishing up my corporate career, I had pushed my body so hard and so far for so long that it couldn't take it anymore. And it collapsed. And I almost lost my life to a severe case of burnout called rhabdo. And the reason I pause and bring this up is because what got me to that place wasn't just the professional pursuits that I was creating to try to allow myself the space to step away. It was also how I was navigating and compartmentalizing in my personal life. I was pushing down challenging emotion. I was waiting to deal with things later. I was storing all of this emotion and challenging experiences in my body because I needed to create the space and time to do what I was doing professionally. And when you do that, we experience the same level of stress and exhaustion and tension within us that we experience from our work and burnout. So I was parallel pathing and compartmentalizing in ways that I'm sure a lot of you can relate to as entrepreneurs and most likely high performers, where it can become very normal to let our ego drive and live in a way that it tells us these other things can wait, but they don't wait. They get pushed down and they get stored. And that can also create a lot of challenging emotion and be a big factor of burnout. A lot of times we think about burnout as I'm doing too much, I'm moving too fast, but burnout can also really be impacted by what we don't address and what we don't face. So I think that's important to note. So after I went through this burnout, this change, I knew I wanted a different life. I made the changes. I had the severe case of burnout. It had me in the hospital for a week after almost losing my life. In that pause and space, I heard my true self louder again. And this is a good example of exactly what happens. When we create the space to hear it, our true self shows up and communicates because it's always trying to communicate, but oftentimes we're just so busy and running and our ego has us driving and going after achievement and accomplishment. We can't hear those messages from our true self. So my true self showed up. I could feel it calling me towards inner work. And I created space, turned all of my focus inward, and I moved very quickly and deeply through what I now know was an internal rebalancing and awakening. And it was all while quarantining in my apartment in New York City during COVID. It was a very isolated, but very beautiful experience. And it ended up being this factory reset for life that really brought me back to the baseline level of my true self. And it changed everything. So why did I share this with you before we get started? Well, first, I think it's nice to know who's up here talking to you, so I'm not just some random talking head. But more than that, it's because it's a perfect example of the dance that we are all doing between our true self and our ego every day. But a lot of times that dance is happening subconsciously. And it's so important to create awareness around when our true self is leading, when our ego is leading, and understanding the impact of each. Because that awareness, and I'll touch on this more as we talk through the content, that awareness gives us the gift of conscious choice and change. So now as we talk about what our ego is, how it shows up, you can have some examples to see the things that it can do and how it can create complications in our life and how it can sometimes drive us towards goals that externally seem like they're great and very satisfying and exciting, but in the end, they don't make us happy and they create more conflict because they're not aligned with who we are. So why does this become so important? And I'm sure with what I just said and walking through my story, you've picked up on some of that, but this is such a powerful question. It's important that we address it more specifically. Take a quick sip of water. Sorry, guys, my frog voice. My famous quote, or sorry, I wish it was my famous quote. My favorite quote really answers this question perfectly. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life. I'm going to say that one more time. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. There's so much power in that sentence. And this was a quote from Carl Jung, who's a famous Swiss psychologist and psychiatrist. And what this brings attention to is that regardless of who we are or how much we've achieved in life, we're all being impacted by and driven by our ego's unconscious programming every day. And it's important to not let your ego convince you that you aren't a victim of this, because what it will do is if you're, let's say, the CEO of a Fortune 100 company, it will use that external success to say, well, no, you're not being driven by your ego. Everything's going great. Look at this external success. Things are perfect. But the unconscious programming playing in the background is still holding you back if you haven't created awareness around it. So maybe you'd be the CEO of a Fortune 10 company, or maybe you'd be like me and you'd be doing something completely different. We don't know the answer to that question, but what's powerful and important to know about this is that that unconscious programming is that important. It creates a life that we think is fate, that we think is us, and it drives all of that unconsciously until we stop allowing it to, and we use awareness to better understand it. So how do we stop this? How do we create change? Our greatest weapon against our ego is awareness. Once we create awareness around how our ego is showing up, we give ourselves the gift of conscious choice and change. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but the reason that's so important is because if we are conscious about what's going on, it can no longer direct our life and call it fate, like Carl Jung was saying in his quote. So my story I told you about at the beginning of this talk is a great example of that. If I hadn't paused and taken the time to create awareness around what was happening in my life, why I was experiencing the conflict I was experiencing, why I wasn't feeling connected to the success I was achieving. If I hadn't paused and used awareness to better understand those situations, I might have still been living in that first circle and maybe forever, who knows? But because I created awareness around that conflict, I created awareness around something not feeling right, I was able to dive into the whys underneath it and reconnect with my true self and start to create change. So you can see how it becomes so important, because if something is running in the background, we're on autopilot with it. Once we create that awareness, we give ourselves the opportunity to decide if we still want to live that way and if we still want it in our life. And I think it's important to note too, I always say this to my clients, every high performer, every entrepreneur, every anyone doesn't necessarily need a drastic life change. My story was my story because that's what was right for me. But what we do all need is to be able to see that unfiltered truth that I'm speaking about. We have to be able to see and understand exactly who we are be able to make the right decision and choices that are for us. Because if we don't, our decisions and choices are oftentimes being driven by something and towards something that we don't actually want. So what is our ego? The famous question. So we have some initial insights around how it can show up, how it can hold us back, the importance of understanding it, and how we can use awareness to get to that place. And we hear ego tossed around a lot in high performance environments, especially, but what actually is the ego? Our ego is our learned and adopted or created sense of self. So oftentimes we'll hear things like bravado or someone that's overly concerned about their looks or selfishness, all being associated with the word ego. And it's important to know that none of those things are actually what our ego is. They do come up in association with our ego oftentimes because they can be examples of an unhealthy relationship with our ego. But these are symptoms of that unhealthy relationship. They aren't what an ego is. Our ego is this created sense of self. And so what does that mean and where does our ego come from? And the best way to answer this and see how it's impacted our life from the very beginning is to start from the beginning. So before we jump into how this lays out, are there any questions that anyone has about the initial setup of what the ego is or how it can show up?
And feel free
Okay.
to drop any questions in the chat and I'll chime in with them to all attendees, just so you know. Thanks, Ashley.
Perfect. Yeah, no problem. Okay, so let's look at this in terms of stages of development. So I touched briefly on the true self when I was talking about my story, and the true self is exactly where this all begins. So we are born whole and complete as our true self. And we are born whole and complete. We are free from all external needs and attachments. So our true self becomes this natural state of being and balance in this place of true freedom. So you can basically think of it as this is who we are before we are impacted by the external world. In stage 2, we have the creation of the ego self. As we're conditioned by life and our experiences, our ego is created by our mind to help us make sense of and protect us from the world around us. So it isn't who we are, but because of how strong and powerful it can become, we often start to believe it is, meaning we start to adopt this ego self as part of who we are, as our true self and identity. So our ego is formed around the external messages we've received about ourselves, others, and the world. And this starts to taint and change our view of everything around us. So we're born whole and complete as our true self. We don't know any of these external impacts, but our ego is developed and starts to create doubt, starts to tell us that we need something external, starts to tell us that something is missing. And this happens even more and more in high performance environments, or for example, as an entrepreneur, where we're really having to fight and push a lot. The more we fight and push and use our head, the stronger it gets. It's like a muscle. So think about it if you're using your bicep to do bicep curls. The more you do them, the stronger it gets, the bigger muscle you can lift. And it's the same cycle with your ego and your true self. I often say it's like David and Goliath. We're using and exercising our ego so much every day that it gets so big and strong, it can actually convince us it's who we are, that it's our true identity. And that's how it takes over our true self and starts to mute it and push it further down. In stage 3, we have this unconscious programming developing that I was speaking about earlier. And really stage 2, you'll see a little gray line at the top. Stage 2, 3, and 4 can kind of all go together, but I broke them out to really help separate things and help to make this progression of how our ego is getting stronger and developing make more sense. So to continue its protection and maintain control, our ego tries to falsely convince us we aren't whole or complete, and that we need something external to achieve success, happiness, freedom, or just to feel good enough. So it does this by using those life experiences we have, and it starts to create false truths and limiting beliefs. And so these false truths and limiting beliefs become this unconscious programming we were talking about. So let's use an example. So let's say at a young age, you have an experience where you learn that you only receive love when you achieve. So that's an experience that you had. But what our ego would do is it would internalize that as a limiting belief and attach to it. And instead of saying this is an experience we had, it would create an identity around it and use that unconscious programming to drive how we see and show up in life. So we would become someone that believes love is only received when you achieve, versus being someone that had an experience where you received love when you achieve. And linguistically, those can sound like small distinctions, but I'm sure you guys can see how powerful that is. Anytime we say I am and we take on identity, whatever that is, whatever that experience was, now being a part of us or feeling like it's part of us, part of that unconscious programming, the ego, is very powerful because it affects how we show up every day, which affects both our internal and external worlds. Stage 4 is the impact. So we have this unconscious programming running in the background telling us we aren't good enough, that there's something missing internally that we have to fill externally. We operate from a place of lack, limitation, need, and fear. And this affects our ability to see and step into our true potential. And it prevents us from experiencing true fulfillment. And I won't dive too deep into this now because this can be a separate subject matter all its own, but it's also really important to note that the ego isn't bad. Even the way I'm talking about it right now sounds like I'm shaming it. And I want to note that that is not the case. We all have egos as humans. The ego is part of us. And what becomes so important is to use this awareness to create a healthier relationship with our ego, because our ego is coming from a place of protection. So as I said in the earlier stage 2, it's trying to help us make sense of and protect us from the world. The challenge becomes that a lot of times the ways it's trying to help us make sense of and protect us from the world are ways that keep us really small and keep us in our box. Because if we're small and in our box, we're easier to protect. But as you know, when we're small and in our box, we're also not reaching fulfillment. We're not experiencing growth. We're not seeing our full potential. So it's important to know the ego isn't bad, but the way it shows up and protects us, unless we're using awareness to create powerful change and to create a healthy relationship with it, usually the way it's initially trying to protect us is holding us back and slowing us down. What makes it so important to be aware of this? So we now know that we're born with everything we need as our true self. But as our ego is created by our mind, it tries to falsely convince us we aren't, as a means of that protection and control. And then as part of that, it creates this unconscious programming, including false truths and limiting beliefs, impacting how we see and show up in the world and how we see and show up for ourselves. The reason it's so important to be aware of this is because if we're not aware of it, we stay focused on the symptoms we're experiencing and we never get to the source. And what I mean by this is, as humans, we're conditioned to look at and try to change our actions. And this is very purposeful. Our ego wants us playing in the action space. It wants us playing on the surface, because as long as we play on the surface and we're struggling with our actions, we don't go deeper to understand why. We don't get to that place of creating awareness around how our ego is showing up, around what that unconscious programming is or what those limiting beliefs are. So as long as our ego can get us excited about and sad about and afraid of what's happening on the surface, it can keep us there. But to create real change, we have to create awareness around and focus on the source. And to do that, we have to get very clear about and understand what exactly that source is. And in this case, our source is our beliefs. And I'll show you what I mean. Beliefs drive thoughts. Thoughts drive emotions. And emotions drive actions. And that gray highlighted word right there, the actions, is exactly where our ego wants us to stay focused. Playing on the surface where we can't create real or lasting change. But if we know beliefs drive thoughts, and thoughts drive emotions, and emotions drive actions, we can see why just trying to change our actions can be so frustrating. And why it oftentimes doesn't work, right? Because our actions are these symptoms of this deeper source. So to really change them, we need to create awareness around and change the source driving them. And this is why connecting the dots between the unconscious programming holding us back that we talked about earlier and this belief to action process becomes so important. Because unconscious ego programming creates limiting beliefs. And so our source can be tainted. So if our beliefs are a source, and we have this unconscious ego programming that's driving some of our beliefs, we can see how then our thoughts, our emotions, and our actions would also be driven from an ego place. So all of this helps us to see how important it is to really dive deep, to understand what's going on beneath the surface. Because if we just spend time saying, okay, I don't like that I'm showing up in this way, I'm going to change it, I'm going to set reminders, I'm going to create rules that I have to follow, all we're doing is giving the problem more power by putting more energy into it. But why are we doing that? If we can create awareness around and change the why that's making us want to do that, the symptom automatically falls away and resolves on its own, because the source programming that was driving that symptom no longer exists. So I think the best way to have something like this come to light is to use an example. So for this example, we're going to use that you are overdue for promotion and that your work and performance show you deserve it. So the truth here is that you deserve the promotion. So if there are any little limiting beliefs or your ego is trying to show up and be like, well, maybe I don't fully deserve it, you can quiet those down. In this example, the truth that we're going to lean on is that you fully deserve this promotion. Okay. So now let's play with what happens in this scenario if you're carrying a limiting belief versus a true belief. And we'll start with the limiting belief. So as we talked, a limiting belief is one that is holding you back, that is keeping us small. It's part of that unconscious ego programming. So it's a belief that's born out of our ego as a way to maintain that control and protection. One of the most common limiting beliefs, and I'm sure you guys have all heard this, it's very common in the world of coaching and self-awareness in general, is I'm not good enough. So we'll play with I'm not good enough as our example. And if we're holding the limiting belief of I'm not good enough, what thought or thoughts might that drive? Thoughts like, I can't ask for a promotion. I still have more to learn or do. I'm not there yet. I don't deserve it. So all of these powerful thoughts start to come up because the truth is one thing, but what we are believing inside isn't matching that truth. And so what our thoughts aren't going to match the truth. They're going to match what we're believing inside. So if we have these thoughts, if I'm not there yet, or I don't deserve it, what emotions could that create? Emotions like stress, anxiety, sadness, frustration, overwhelm. And then we have powerful emotions like these. And what actions would those drive? Avoiding the promotion conversation, remaining in a role you've outgrown, and in turn, potentially slowing down both your professional and personal growth. So you can see why it becomes so important to get to the core of what's driving us, because our action just becomes an example or symptom of an autopilot that we start to move on. So now let's take a look at this exact same example, but if we're carrying a true belief. So for this one, we'll make it green and pretty so it stands out. And for this one, let's look at the classic I am good enough. So we have I am not good enough, I am good enough, shows up all the time in awareness work. I'm tweaking this a little bit and I added in here I am beyond good enough because I still think I am good enough feels a little ego to me. I think it's not too often that we just say I want to be good enough, right? So there feels like there's still a little bit of downplaying going on. So let's play with I am beyond good enough, which feels a lot closer to the truth to me. And if that's the belief that we are carrying at our core, let's look at how that changes how we think, feel, and show up in life. So if we believe we are beyond good enough, some examples of thoughts that belief might drive are, I'm excited to schedule time to ask about promotion. I know I deserve it and I'm ready. And if we have these thoughts of knowing we deserve it and we're ready, let's think about what emotions would come with those. Emotions like excitement, feeling confident, proud, energized, inspired. And if we're feeling excited, confident, proud, energized, and inspired, how different is that action that we take going to be? We're most likely going to want to proactively schedule that promotion conversation so that we can showcase our accomplishments and why we deserve to be promoted, and in turn, positively impact our professional and personal growth versus holding ourselves back. So from this example, we can see why creating awareness around that source, that unconscious ego programming that's driving those limiting beliefs, becomes so important because they are the driving source for how we show up in life. And once we create awareness around and change that source, the limiting action we were struggling with will automatically change. Because like I mentioned before, that old source programming driving it no longer exists.
Ashley, can I chime in with an attendee question?
Yeah, please.
So Lindsay wrote in, is this like TFAR in cognitive behavioral therapy, thinking, feeling, action, result?
It's similar. I mean, I think everything in this world is similar and just uses different language for it usually. I'm not specifically familiar with that, but just from how the acronym is described, my guess is yes. The gist of usually all descriptions or tools like this are that we have to go to a deeper source to create change. So it sounds like that one's rooted in the same concept. Is that it?
Yep, that's all the questions for now.
Perfect, perfect. And I love that. It's good. You'll start to see that in this work, and I think this is so important, everyone who works in this space speaks about it a little bit differently. And that's a good thing because it gets us to the same root cause, usually and root source of change. But we all hear things and we all digest things differently. So having that opportunity to have different language out there, some people might connect to one more than the other. So I think it's great, and it's great to bring that up. Okay, so we saw how different our lives can be and how differently we react depending on what beliefs we're carrying. So how can we use this as a tool? And it's important to note that if this is some new information for you, you already will start using it as a tool. That's the beautiful thing about any sort of insights or learnings in awareness work. We hear them, we see them, we feel them, and we can't unhear or unsee or unfeel them. So I always joke with my clients, it's kind of like you can't start believing in Santa Claus again, even if you really, really want to, sometimes because it was a simpler time. We can't unhear or unsee things that make sense to us because they're rooted in truth. And so it starts to create this little crack that starts to create change, even if we're not consciously aware of that change. So some of what we're discussing around the ego, if it's new information for you, it will already start to be creating that change. But what we're going to do is also take this information and put it into a more specific tool that you can use so that you have something that you're armed with when you start to notice these ego reactions, thoughts showing up. The first step in this tool becomes identifying an ego thought when it shows up and it's trying to hold you back. And so the reason we're starting with thought here is thought is usually the easiest to identify. So you want to pay attention to it so that when you notice a thought that's showing up and telling you to play small or avoid change or that you can't do something, you want to start to have that red flag of, okay, this is an ego thought. It's holding me back. It's keeping me small. This isn't coming from my true self and trying to drive me in a positive way. This is an ego thought. And that initial awareness around that thought is what can help you create the change that you want to create. So in the beginning, this can sometimes be a little bit challenging because we're sort of used to these thoughts. Unfortunately, it can be a bit of an autopilot. So if you find yourself struggling to identify the thought right away, pay attention to the emotion. So if you start to feel yourself feeling the stress, anxiety, or frustration or overwhelm, anything that we talked about, or any sort of similar associated emotions, you also want to have that flag of there's some sort of ego response happening here. Because again, think of our true self as our just unconditional love best friend. It's not going to do anything that makes us uncomfortable or makes us experience anything uncomfortable. Our ego is not the enemy or bad, but it's trying to protect us and keep us small. So when we experience emotions that feed into or continue to encourage us to play small or not show up in the way that we can or we know that we have the ability to, it's coming from our ego. So if you don't notice the thought right away, but you get to a place where you're feeling the stress or you're feeling this emotion that is really starting to hold you back, you can use that as well and know, okay, this is a flag as well. This is my ego. Let's take a step back and think, what is the thought that's creating this? So after we've identified that thought, or we've used the emotion to backtrack and identify that thought, we start the reversal. So instead of that pattern that we saw in the earlier slides, where we move into whatever that emotion and action would be, we cancel that process and we stop those drivers. And instead, we reverse the process and we allow ourselves to get curious about the limiting belief driving that thought. So what is the source cause of this thought? So a great way to do this is to ask yourself, what must I be believing for that thought to be true? And this is a really powerful question because it can help to sort of crystallize something that can be challenging to wrap our heads around. So if we use our example from earlier, the thoughts were, I'm not ready, or I don't deserve a promotion. To be thinking that way, we must have been believing that we aren't good enough. And that was exactly the case. So we can use that question to say, what must I believe for me to be thinking this, to help us identify that limiting belief that's holding us back? And once we've done that, we want to challenge the limiting belief's validity. which helps us create awareness around the truth. We identify the limiting belief. We know it's a limiting belief because we've already experienced the thought or also the thought and emotion that's driving it. So we know it's coming from our ego. If it's a belief coming from our ego, it's not real. It's something that's been created. So let's start to challenge the truth and validity so that we can get to what is true. So for this one, you can ask yourself questions like, is this belief true? Very simple. Is this something I still believe? Is this something I want to carry? Is it serving me? So you can start to ask yourself questions that get to the core of why this belief currently exists, already knowing it's not true. And that usually helps to shed and create awareness around what is the truth. What is this belief trying to cover up and prevent me from experiencing and seeing? When you have your answer and you can see that it's not true and it isn't serving you, you can now use that new awareness to choose a belief that is true and is serving you. And we'll jump into that in a second. But what I want to note first is if you're struggling in the beginning to see and connect the limiting belief not being true, that's okay. These can be very powerful beliefs. These can be things we've accepted as truth since we were young. And so it can take some time to get to that core truth of them not being true. I'm using that word a lot, but you can see why. So if that's hard, it's okay. It's very normal. And I'll finish things off after this example with some tools that you can use to dive a little bit deeper if you start to feel that resistance around releasing or creating awareness around the truth underneath a limiting belief. So know that help is coming in a second, but for this example, let's just assume that you've identified the limiting belief, you know it's not true, and so now you're ready for the next step. So now you're ready to choose that new belief that is true and does serve you. So in step 3, we're back to our pretty green. The world is bright and friendly, and we replace that limiting belief with this new true and supportive belief. And you want to make sure you get very clear and specific and that you really connect with it being true. So it's like the concept of, manifesting. I like to equate it to. I think manifesting can be a really powerful tool, and I do encourage my clients to use it. But a lot of times we pick things that we don't connect with or believe are true internally. And so we're fighting ourselves every time we try to manifest or we try to use that as a tool. Deep down, we want to believe and connect with what we're focusing on. And it becomes the same for this true belief. So it's a similar concept here where we want to make sure we choose that belief that we really connect with and we really believe and see the truth in it. And now that process clicks into a supportive autopilot rather than a limiting one. So we have this new belief that supports us, encourages us, and that supportive belief will organically create a thought that serves and supports us. And that supportive thought will then create emotions that serve and support us. And the supportive emotion will create action that serve and support us. So again, this is just 2 different ways of looking at that. We created awareness around how different we show up in the world, depending on what that belief driver is. And now we've created awareness around the fact that we can use that awareness again as our tool to say, okay, wait a minute, I see the ego showing up. Rather than letting it take me on this autopilot that doesn't support me, let's pause for a minute. Let's trace back the source of what's creating this initial thought, and let's undo it. Let's challenge its validity. Let's release it, and let's adopt a thought that is true and does serve me so that this action process also is true and does serve me. So I want to close things out by going through what I had spoken about on this last slide. When we have these beliefs that we've carried for a really long time, it can at times be challenging to see them as not true. And we can also feel some duality when we're trying to do that. So in our head, we can say, of course, I know I'm good enough. But down here, we might not feel it somewhere. There's somewhere where we still don't believe it, that we're carrying, that there is a part of it that is still true. So if it is a belief that we've carried for a long time, even if we can see it's true, and there is that part deep down that we aren't able to connect with that truth, we can use some deeper inner questions to try to get underneath the internal conflict, or resistance to release the limiting belief. And so I included these in the next slide. And what we'll do is we'll use that same example of I'm beyond good enough. So before we dive into it, I want to add it is important to not look at any sort of resistance as good or bad. This is very similar to what we spoke about with the ego. So in life, we really don't want to look at anything as good or bad, but especially in inner work, anything that we experience, resistance included, is a tool. I always say to my clients, they want to hit me sometimes, I'm sure, but resistance is our best friend, because when we're struggling with something, when we feel resistance to something, there's a reason, there's a block that is creating us. And so that becomes this internal arrow showing us exactly where we need more awareness, where we need more healing oftentimes. And so any form of resistance or challenge in inner work is actually our best friend, and that's how we grow and how we go deeper. So if you start to play with this tool and start to try to release these limiting beliefs and it's challenging, remind yourself that that's a gift, and it's giving you the opportunity to look more closely at exactly where there's more awareness or more healing needed. So as we look at deeper inner work, the first question you could ask yourself, if you're struggling to let go of a limiting belief that's been there for a long time. Sorry, I'm just going to take one more sip of water. Sorry, guys. You want to ask yourself, when do I remember this showing up for the first time? And I mean like very, very first time. We want to go back as far as we possibly can, because just like you want to get to the source of the symptoms that you're experiencing or actions you're experiencing, when it comes to beliefs, we want to try to get to that source of what initially created this belief. What was that experience I had? What was that meaning I attached that I am now carrying as a belief? So we really want to get back to that very first moment so we can create awareness around what it really was and release the belief that we've been carrying. So the first question that you can play with is, when do I remember this belief first showing up? The second question, and I touched on this a little bit in the first, is what happened in that moment that created the belief? So what were you experiencing? What meaning did your ego assign to that experience? And you really want to get to the root source or cause here, like I was saying before, because our belief is an assigned meaning. So we have a challenging experience, like we talked about before in terms of love being based on achievement. You have an experience where you saw that you received love when you achieved, but that was just an experience. But our ego would create meaning around that and tell us that that's the way the world works. And that's our belief, and that's how we move through life. So we want to create awareness around, when we had that experience, what meaning did we assign to that experience? Because that is what has become our limiting belief. In question 3, we want to ask ourselves, where deep down do I still believe this is true, and why? And really ask yourself this and try to feel into the response. Try to create some space for this one so you can kind of hear yourself trying to answer it. So for example, is it from your 5-year-old self that was hurting during the experience that created the belief and it hasn't fully healed or let go? Or is it from your 15-year-old self that was being bullied and struggling with fully and unconditionally accepting yourself? And it may sound funny, I know, we hear work about inner child, et cetera, and it may sound funny to think about that, especially if we've moved on and we're older. But what happens if we don't address and change the source of when something was created? We will always carry it. So that's why it becomes so important to go that far back, because we need to tell ourselves and teach ourselves the truth about what that experience was. And that's what lets us release it, and it creates this ongoing impact of releasing everything that was connected to it. So if you were hurt really badly when you were 5 years old and you created this assigned meaning and belief, you have to go back to that experience, create awareness around it, and let yourself heal so that you can see that experience for what it is without the attachment and assigned meaning that was created on top of it, so that you can really start to release and heal, and then release the impact and weight that it's been carrying in your life. And lastly, for question 4, what do I need to do to heal and let go of this belief? So if we know that we have a place where we still believe it's true, and we want to learn why, then how do we actually heal and let go? What do we need from ourselves to do that? And this is another one with 3 and 4. It's really important to create that space to listen to yourself. And this part can get hard. We touched on that before. If we've learned and believed something for 20, 30, 40 years, it's challenging to face the truth that it's not true, because it creates a little bit of a crack in the facade of the world that we've accepted as life. So it can get challenging to do these, and it can shake us a little bit. But just like resistance, it's great if you get shaken a little bit. And again, probably something else my clients get mad at me for saying. But when we're in those challenging moments where we're feeling that like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I believe this. I can't believe this led my life and it's not true. And we're having those moments where it shakes us. On the other side is the growth. And on the other side is the freedom. So we want to allow ourselves to see that truth so that we can get to the other side of releasing the false truth and the baggage and heaviness that it's been making us carry all of the years. So one way to do this is to really go back and heal. And within inner work in general, I do transformational work, but honestly, any inner work comes with a healing approach to it. So you want to make sure that you do allow yourself to heal and feel any emotions that you didn't allow yourself to feel. So a lot of times when we're having that experience where we're in the moment that a limiting belief is being created, we have a lot of emotion around that experience because it's challenging to deal with. But because that emotion is challenging, we don't deal with it and release it in that moment. So instead we push it down, similarly to what I did myself while I was at Amazon. We push that down and we store it. And so as we're creating awareness around a belief not being true, seeing that we assigned a meaning, that doesn't mean that meaning exists for the entire world or everything around us. We also need to allow ourselves to heal and experience the emotion that we stored when we first had that moment. So this can come with screaming into a pillow, letting yourself cry and feel bad and feel the pain that came with that experience, forgiving yourself if subconsciously you've held some guilt around not showing up the way you wanted to in that moment. So it's really sitting with and leaning into, what do I need to do to fully heal and let go of what I'm carrying so I stop these chain reactions of this impacting my life and showing up the way that it has been. And that is the end. So if it feels like a lot, I know it's not a lot of content in terms of time-wise, but it's a lot of content in terms of some heaviness and a lot of information. So if it feels like a lot, or especially if you felt resistance, like if anything in here kind of made you mad, or you felt like it wasn't true, or you felt a lot of resistance, really lean into that afterwards, because that's what I'm speaking about, where when our ego gets triggered, it gets defensive and it kind of wants to go like this. It's like a caged animal or a trapped animal in a corner. So if you notice anywhere where you had resistance or anything showing up like that, those are also great opportunities to go deeper. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. For my social platforms, I just share tips every day on conscious living and experiences I've had with my work and working in this. So if you need a daily dose of conscious living or ego awareness, you can find me at Ashley Reed Official on both LinkedIn and Instagram.
Yay, thank you so much, Ashley. Oh my gosh, this was so beautiful. It's such an amazing session. I'm just checking the chat here. Erin says, thank you. She loves your illustrations of the mental leaps you can fall back on when you need to manage limiting beliefs. Yeah, we all appreciated your presentation so much. Lindsay says, thank you for the process and the framework. This is phenomenal. I'm gonna just leave this open for a minute to just let any questions trickle in. But just wanted to make sure that thank you so much, Ashley, for all of
you're so welcome.
And for showing up when you don't feel good.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I really feel like you guys did not get the best version of me. So thank you for bearing with me, but I hope the work spoke for itself and was still helpful.
Absolutely. I'm going to leave our feedback form in the chat. It's anonymous. We would just love to know what you all think of these so that we can continue to put great office hours presentations on for you. Oh, Michelle asked a question. What are some classic or recommended thoughts to fight feelings of not feeling like enough?
Yeah, so I like how this is worded. So one of the things here too is you don't want to try to fight that with a thought, right? So that kind of ties into what we were talking about before, because then you're still playing up here, which can actually make this muscle bigger and stronger. So you want to try to do a similar version to what we were doing, where you want to get to that source of why don't you feel like enough? What is that reason? When did you first start feeling like you weren't enough? Because you create awareness around that initial moment where you felt that way, and then you can prove it's not true and you can let go of it. But what you don't want to do, and what our ego has us doing quite a bit, and it's very normal, this is the human reaction. I'm thinking this, I don't want to think it. What can I do to change it? the best way to change it is the very same concept of figuring out why you're believing it or feeling it in the first place, because then you can prove it's not true and let go of it. So ask yourself questions very similar to what we did in this presentation. When do I first remember feeling that way? Why am I feeling that way? Is that true? I always say curiosity and empathy, curiosity and empathy. So there's a very big difference between asking ourselves, why am I feeling that way? And why am I feeling that way, right? True self, first one, ego, second one. So we want to stay in that place of compassion and curiosity, not let our ego come in with judgment, and just really get to know ourselves better and try to better understand what is the source of the challenge, because then we can solve and release that source.
Love that. Amazing.
Great question, by the way. It's one of the biggest ones out there.
Awesome. Any other questions before we hop off and wrap up for today? Like I said, I did leave that little feedback form about today's session in the chat for all who attended. If you wouldn't mind filling that out, that would be great.
Yeah, and thank you guys so much again for coming and spending the time. I hope it was helpful, and just remember to be kind to yourself. You know, we live in a tough world where our ego is showing up a lot to try to protect us, and that's okay. So when you feel challenges, resistance, when you feel anything, just remember that we're also human that needs that same unconditional love and compassion from ourselves. And that in itself can kind of soften and help us through really challenging times.
Thank you so much, Ashley. This was
You're welcome.
phenomenal and so fascinating and helpful and impactful and generous. And we hope that you feel better. And we just so appreciate your time.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, wishing everybody a great rest of your week, and we'll hop off. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Have a good one, guys.
Bye-bye.